This is the whole, some people would say, is a cycle of doom. Cuts cause, therefore, less jobs, causes greater unemployment, causes greater burden on the taxpayer via benefit payments, and then you just go round and round in the cycle.
Well, the response to it was basically to blame the previous lot. The Labor government. It's all their fault.
Do you think they can still do that? It's been a year they've been doing that now.
Governments blame the previous governments for years. They'll carry on doing it for as long as they can.
New titles are coming and going. I mean, even sort of titles that pop up online and are cool to a certain demographic for a period of time and are then bought by the major mastheads. That they're sort of having a couple of years in the sun and then fading from view. So it's pretty grim out there and difficult to see a way forward.
And look, my view is it's probably going to follow a similar path to the 90-day trial.
Welcome to the Weekly Wrap, where we go over the top video stories from the past week. First up, the Labor Party's finance spokesperson Barbara Edmonds is not resiling from calling Finance Minister Nicola Willis the nightmare before Christmas. Edmonds' colourful description came after the release of the half-year economic and fiscal update on Tuesday, which she said shocked her with how bad the numbers were. Our political editor Brent Edwards with this.
At the end of 2024, the government released its books, opened its books, and it wasn't pretty reading. To talk about the state of the economy and the state of the public finances, I'm joined by Labor's finance spokesperson, Barbara Edmonds. Now, you were pretty critical of the Finance Minister, Nicola Willis, about that. She's blaming Labor, you're blaming her.
I think I called her the nightmare before Christmas. Yeah, so it was pretty critical. And effectively, when I opened HIFU at 1 o'clock yesterday, I was just surprised and shocked at how bad the numbers actually were.
But we've been getting that, haven't we, from actually a lot of forecasters over probably, the last couple of years almost, where every time the forecast seems to get worse than the previous forecast.
And I think that really comes down to, they do have a whole data set of information. This is Treasury. And, they also take into account, business confidence surveys, etc. But ultimately, the numbers are the numbers that they forecast. That's what governments, set their operating allowances, set their debt GDP figures. That's what they set their fiscal strategy on. It's just by and by what happens every year. And Treasury do the books, and it's the Minister of Finance who endorses them.
Of course, one of the things, and I think you've raised this, that the government did a decision it did make was around, obviously, tax cuts, bringing back deductibility for landlords, which has had an impact on the books. I mean, how much responsibility then does government take for its books being in perhaps worse shape than they otherwise would be?
Well, if you talk to Nicola Willis and Christopher Luxon, they would say it's not our fault. Those were the choices we made. We wanted to give tax relief. The issue I have with it, however, is that it was quite clear at the time that they gave the tax relief that people, the higher income earners were more likely to use it to pay off their mortgage. Those who are on lower incomes, got $2.25, or pensioners got $2.25 a week. That's not enough in the respect for them to actually deal with the cost of living. And then on the other hand, they were ripping away other transfers. So, for example, public transport subsidy fees have now been reduced. In the Wellington region, you'll see 70% increase in public transport fees for next year. They've also, narrowed prescription fees to just those on community services cards. And also you look at Three Waters. Three Waters was there to help put downward pressure on rates, to spread the cost out over the life of, not just this generation of ratepayers. So there are a number of fiscal decisions that were made by the government, their choices, which I believe had not helped those during a cost of living crisis.
Well, with the shift in forecasts and in their budget policy statement, they're foreshadowing more cuts in spending, although Nicola Willis says it won't affect education, health and police. Do you think that that's possible?
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely clear in her budget policy statement that she said there are going to be more cuts, and more cuts than what was estimated this year. So, for example, the other issue that I have with that is that she has pretty much spent most of her budget for 2025. So there's only about $700 million left. There's a number of pay agreements for public servant roles. For example, you've got nurses who are striking at the moment. that money needs to come from somewhere. And so $700 million to do all these different initiatives to deal with cost pressures. Treasury already in 2024, budget 2024, said that their operating allowance was too low, wouldn't even cover cost pressures. So it's going to be really interesting to see how the government gets out of this next year.
Yeah, because how do you think they can deal with it just within health, the cost pressures of rising costs of healthcare, rising demand? How does it manage that within that $2.4 billion allowance, which, as you said, much of which is already committed?
So part of the health budget, if you read the budget policy statement, it says it's outside of that operating allowance. So they say $700 million for everything else in the government, plus health on top. I don't know how they're going to get there. They're depending on the charities tax, which the Minister of Finance has advised that there'll be a new charity tax next year. It takes time for that to build up. And my question really is, okay, if you're going to introduce a charities tax next year, good luck trying to figure out the boundary there. You know, how do you tax the Salvation Army or the Mary Potter Hospice, who has this little op shop who are trying to sell goods to put money back into the charity, versus the larger, and I'm not going to name them, the larger, more commercial companies who sell cereal. Officials time and time again have tried to find that boundary for governments. It's a really difficult thing to do, but then even if they do find that boundary, when does that money actually start to come in? Because it won't be this financial year, it'll probably be the next.
Now, I mean, obviously, Labor, had it been in government, wouldn't have cut taxes in 2024, and you would have cut some spending, but much, much less than the government. So how would the numbers then look under your sort of stewardship? You'd still be looking at big deficits, wouldn't you?
Well, see, the hypothetical examples that we sort of given from the Minister of Finance this year assumes that everything is the same. However, we would have based our fiscal plan, which we did in the last election, based off PREFU. So PREFU had that track around what our infrastructure spending is in housing, health, other programs. It also had our spending in relation to cost pressures. So for me, it's a really broad question. Everybody says, well, what would Labor have done? We would have stuck to what we had committed to in our fiscal plan. We would have stuck to the numbers we had in PREFU. Yes, as a government, if the numbers were not great, we would have had to have adjusted that. But that was why Grant Robertson started the fiscal savings program in 2023. So there are different levers that we would have had to look at.
And you argue too then that the cuts that have been put in place, the pause around investment in infrastructure, has worsened the slowdown. So I guess hugely. And you've got 12,000 fewer construction workers. Where have those jobs gone to? They've gone overseas to Australia, where there is a very clear pipeline of infrastructure planning happening in the different states in Australia. So you're seeing skilled workers. We're at record net migration with over 55,000 people that have actually left our shores. So when you take that into account, when you stop government programs that are building things, there is less money in the economy from those construction workers who are then using their pay, using their job, the salary that they get to spend it in the rest of the economy. So ultimately, the government has given with tax cuts, but hasn't invested enough in the productive side of the economy to keep things going while the rest of the economy recovers. But the Treasury says that part of the deficit is structural. So irrespective of the economic cycle, there's a deficit that has to be dealt with. That it's not just going to be all go away when the economy, starts growing again.
So you need to ask that question closer to the election when we come out with our manifesto, and that's the choices that governments have to make, and Labor has been quite clear. We are thinking about different types of policies. We are thinking obviously about tax. We are thinking about savings. Those are the different policies that governments will need to consider in order to help the future longer term structural deficits that are coming through.
I mean, and I guess the Treasury does make the point too that a lot of this is down to what they see as lower productivity than they forecast, which frankly has been an ongoing problem for New Zealand for many years. How do you lift productivity growth that will lift economic growth that will then feed into a better looking set of government books? Yeah,
so you go back to the Treasury papers that were released earlier this year around what are the major issues with New Zealand's productivity. Education is one that you need to make sure that you invest in. Obviously, where we are in the world makes a difference as to, we have to put a lot of things on ships and on freight in order to export it to across the world. So there are different elements which are causing our productivity lag. The issue I have with it, however, is that in an environment like this, where the economy, where the market is failing, the government has a responsibility to step in and to help lift that productivity. That's why we got low productivity coming through. That's why we have fewer jobs. That's why we will have higher unemployment. And the structural deficit is not helped by the number of people who are the more number of people that are going to be unemployed because of the cost of benefits. So this is the whole, some people would say, is a cycle of doom. Cuts cause, therefore, less jobs, causes greater unemployment, causes greater burden on the taxpayer via benefit payments, and then you just go round and round in the cycle.
In this week's Underarm column, MBR's Australian correspondent Lachlan Cahoon takes a look at the long decline of Australian media and journalism. He sat down with co-editor Hamish McNichol.
The opening of the government's books this week revealed more bad news about the economy and the state of the public finances. To talk about that, I'm joined by MBR's political editor, Brent Edwards. Well, Brent, what did the half-year economic and fiscal updates say?
In a word, dismal. It's dismal news. The economy is not growing in anywhere the way that the Treasury thought. So its forecasts from the May budget are wrong. Economic activity is much more sluggish. As a result, the tax take is down on forecast, well down. Some spending's up, and so it means the fiscal situation is a lot worse than the May budget basically pictured. So deficit in this financial year of $17 billion, although the Finance Minister Nicola Willis introduced a new measure which makes it slightly smaller, but nonetheless it's still, and basically pushing out getting back into surplus by at least a year under the new measure, longer under the measure that they used just for the budget.
What was Finance Minister Nicola Willis's response to this?
Well, the response to it was basically to blame the previous lot, the Labor government. It's all their fault.
Do you think they can still do that? It's been a year they've been doing that now.
Governments blame the previous governments for years. They'll carry on doing it for as long as they can, whether people believe them or not. I mean, there is some sense of it because budgets are not just some single thing. They do pick up what's happened in previous budgets. So there's a flow through of that. But the response too, though, is there are things that this government has done that's had an effect on the state of the books, and whether it could have done more to help the economy or not, or whether it's had an effect on slowing the economy, the Labor Party argues it does. So there are those debates going on.
Was there any acknowledgement from the Finance Minister about maybe the effects of those tax cut policies that they introduced? I mean, there were people part of her own coalition who expressed some scepticism about what impact that was going to have on the economy.
No, she doesn't concede that. But of course, when you look at the tax cuts and then including the bringing back tax deductibility for landlords, you're talking about $16 billion or more over the forecast period, so it clearly has an impact on how the books look over that period. And as you're right, the New Zealand First leader Winston Peters said before the election that the economy was in much worse state than people thought, and that National would be stupid to go ahead with tax cuts now. And that was a debate during the coalition negotiations. He had to give ground on that. National was absolutely emphatic about putting tax cuts in place. He's reminded them though that he'd said that, and look at the situation now. And so but you're not going to get National conceding that ground. They felt that tax cuts were worthwhile, obviously, and it was a big political promise that it had made in the build-up to that election, so it was never going to give them away.
The party really campaigned and been their credibility as economic managers. Has that been undermined by what we saw from the Treasury? Or
Well, obviously the opposition are arguing the case, and they say it's a big failure on the part of Nicola Willis. But, it is just 1 year. I guess you've got to give them next year and the year after. That's a 3-year term. So, look at what the state of the economy and the books will be like, I guess, maybe heading into election year, certainly. And, whether there's any light at the end of the tunnel, if there is a sense that, they can get the books back into surplus while growing the economy, because that's one of the things. I mean, in the budget policy statement, which comes alongside the half-year update, they have laid out, well, they're going to look at further spending cuts in response to all of this. Well, where will they cut? Will it have an impact? Because Labor argues the cuts they put in place already helped make the economic slowdown worse than it otherwise would have been. So, all those debates will go ahead over the next year.
Thanks, Lachlan. Happy Christmas in Sydney. And with Christmas just days away, the country has been delivered a dollop of bad news, with the economy and the government's books in worse shape than forecast. This week, Nicholas Poynton and political editor Brent Edwards speak about the upcoming challenges for the government.
As in New Zealand, the media industry in Australia has been in crisis, with mastheads closing and hundreds of journalists and content makers losing their jobs. An agreement for social media platforms to pay for news helped for a while, but the big tech companies walked away from that deal in March, leaving publishers facing a bleak future. Lachlan, can you start with the state of the media industry in Australia?
Hamish, I think it's pretty much similar to what you've been seeing in New Zealand. It's been over the last few years the tale of 1,000 cuts, but in more recent years it's been getting pretty terminal. It's been pretty sick patient, our media. We've had hundreds of job losses in recent years. Possibly thousands of journalists have either retired early, found other jobs, or have actually lost their jobs. There's been restructuring in the cities and consolidation, whereas regional media has really been badly hit. There have been a lot of closures of country newspapers and country radio stations. So none of the old business models of the past are working. You know, classified ads, display advertising, free-to-air television's in crisis. The share prices of our big listed media companies, 9 and 7, are in the doldrums. I mean, this is a year when the ASX has hit record highs. I think 7's shares are down 46%. And even ABC Radio, which is publicly funded, of course, has had a major listener base in the cities. It's losing audience. So new titles are coming and going. I mean, even sort of titles that pop up online and are cool to a certain demographic for a period of time and are then bought by the major mastheads, they're sort of having a couple of years in the sun and then fading from view. So it's pretty grim out there and difficult to see a way forward.
So what was the previous deal that the tech companies walked away from?
This was a code of conduct that they agreed to in 2021. It was a 3-year deal for them to essentially Meta and Google to put in $200 million and cut deals with the major publishers. And these were signed across over 180 mastheads, remembering that some of the mastheads, like the old Fairfax, now 9, had a big portfolio of country newspapers. So after 3 years, the tech company said in March they'd walk away from the deal. Meta said that news wasn't a factor in its business anymore, so why should they subsidise it? So that has created a lot of angst in the media industry, and there have been significant job losses since then as well.
New initiative from the government, though. What's the detail there?
Well, there was a parliamentary inquiry from all parties. This reported in October, and the government seems to be acting. We're waiting on an announcement any day now, actually. But there have already been a lot of leaks. So they're taking a carrot and stick approach where the tech companies with $250 million or more in Australian revenues would have the choice between cutting deals with the publishers or facing financial penalties from the government. So the incentive would be very much to cut deals, because what the government doesn't want to do is collect these fines or taxes from the tech companies and then distribute it through the media industry. They want the tech companies to strike bilateral deals with the media companies. So Meta hasn't actually warmed to the idea. They say once again, why should they subsidise another industry when they're not really using it? But for the industry, it's really breathing a sigh of relief that the government's come to their rescue seemingly and come up with an approach which will really force the big tech companies back to the bargaining table.
Is this really a game changer, though? I mean, what do you think the impact's going to be?
I think it's going to be possibly it will staunch the bleeding for a period of time. I certainly don't think the media industry will be getting back to what it was in a hurry. I mean, it really needs to come up with some compelling new business models, and it's certainly struggled with that in this country anyway. One upside will be that the new deal will cover Australian Associated Press. The other deal didn't do that. I don't know whether people in New Zealand will know Australian Associated Press, but it was a wire service that was previously owned by the major publishers, which largely services the regions. It went broke in 2020, and about 190 journalists lost their jobs then. But it was then purchased by some private equity people. They hired about another 90 journalists. They've had a small amount of government funding since then, but Australian Associated Press, AAP as it's called, really is the bedrock of Australian journalism. It's that old-fashioned facts-only wire service news reporting that the country radio stations lived off, the regional newspapers lived off, and a lot of journalists cut their teeth at Australian Associated Press. So it's been 85 years it was before AAP went bust. So it's been a really important part of the industry, and it was cut out of that previous deal. Deal, but the signs are that it's going to be part of the New Deal, and if it is, then that's going to be welcomed as a really good thing for Australian journalism, and kind of put a floor under some of the losses that we've seen.
Thanks, chaps. Finally this week, Toil and Trouble wraps up all the big employment law changes announced this year, including delays to the Holidays Act reform. Legal Vision Senior Associate Ruby Hollinshead speaks with Fiona Rotherham about what it all means for both employees and employers.
The Minister for Workplace Relations and Safety, Brooke Van Velden, has introduced some major changes for employment law settings this year, including a review of the planned reform of the Holidays Act, among other changes. In this week's Toil and Trouble, Ruby Hollinshead, a Senior Associate at Legal Vision, runs through the most significant changes in 2024. Welcome, Ruby.
Thanks, Fiona.
Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the main changes in employment law this year, how would you sort of characterise the overall thrust? Do you think it's worker or employer friendly?
Look, I'd tend to sort of say possibly employer friendly. I think there's a shift towards making things a bit more certain for employers, which is largely, the theme of a lot of the changes, I would say.
Okay. Let's start with the big one. It actually came at the end of last year. So the repeal of the Fair Pay Agreement regime was sort of the first step?
Yep, that was the first step, sort of end of last year. That sort of came relatively quickly with the new coalition government. So those were removed. And again, that was sort of some certainty for employers around pay and wages and things like that. And then sort of next to that, very soon after, was those 90-day trials, the ability for all businesses to use them, which largely, again, goes to that point I just sort of touched on, is that sort of fairer for employers, gives them the opportunity to sort of take a shot, say, at employees and give them a go under that 90-day trial.
So let's dig into the next one, which is around personal grievances. That's long been an area that's quite fraught for employers, isn't it? So what's happened in that space? Yeah,
there's some big changes in there, and they're relatively recent, Fiona. They sort of they were indicated earlier in the year. However, they've sort of come out with some more. Well, Brooke's come out with some more information on that very, very recently, and it's going to be a higher income threshold. So they've introduced a law that will essentially prevent an employee who has an annual income of more than 180,000 from bringing an unjustified dismissal claim. So this is hopefully going to be determined just on the base salary, as they've said, and it's indicating sort of that they can't raise any personal grievance into that sort of if they're in that threshold, and hopefully sort of provide some certainty. Again, I think some of the commentary around it is that it allows employees to sort of get into these positions and employers to again take a chance and not have to go through what is a relatively complex dismissal process with a lot of risk of a claim there.
It's also removing the eligibility, isn't it, for remedies if an employee is at fault?
Yeah, so that's the second one. They've sort of proposed to remove their right to remedy where their behaviour constitutes serious misconduct, and essentially to prohibit them from seeking reinstatement and compensation for hurt and humiliation if they've contributed to the matter in dispute. So that's a big one. Employers do see a lot of frustration when they think they've followed a fair process, but arguably something's gone wrong and the employee's actually contributed. So essentially, they've signalled that in terms of those technical changes, that they could reduce the amount by up to 100% for that contributory conduct, and that the ERA and the Employment Relations Court, the Employment Court, will be really required to consider that employee's behaviour. And again, there's that sort of threshold for procedural error that's been touched on, and that will sort of perhaps lessen if there are employees' conduct that's contributing to it.
Will that be an end to it, do you think, or do you think there'll be more in this space?
I think there'll be more in this space because they'll be sort of questioning. I think in particular they'll need to finalise some details there. There'll be questions from employers around how to implement this. I think there'll be commentary as to how this is going to be applied based off our current case law. And look, my view is it's probably going to follow a similar path to the 90-day trial, where they have to interpret it very, very, strictly to make sure that it's not unfair for employees and they can't, turning on that, can't raise personal grievances and things like that. Yeah.
Okay, let's turn to contractors because that's another big piece of legislation or, changes that came in this year. So let's. What was the main thing that happened in that space?
Yeah, so that was a big change that sort of came about the second half of this year, and the government's announced sort of further details around that earlier in the year and how it intends to sort of classify whether a worker is a contractor or an employee. Basically, it's an amendment to the current legislation to state, that if a worker satisfies a set of criteria, then they can't challenge their status as a contractor. And if you don't meet that test, they won't be able to challenge essentially their status, which is quite different to the current test. As at the moment, it's sort of a control versus intention test. There's a lot of case law that surrounds it, but it's essentially a different criteria, which I know is basically you have to have a written agreement. You can't restrict the worker from working for other companies, so no restraint of trade. You can't require them to work specific times and hours. And the last one is, if the company doesn't just terminate the contract, if the contractor starts working for someone else or doesn't accept an additional task or engagement. So it's very different to what's currently there, which sort of focuses more on the intention, control, that kind of thing.
Did this follow sort of a number of court cases around this whole issue? Because it's been quite fraught for a long time, hasn't it?
Yeah, well, the Uber case is a very big one. And I think there's a lot of questions, and it does those kind of, big pieces of litigation and court sort of cases that are highly advertised, on the media. People do worry. They reach out and they go, okay, I've got contractors. What am I doing wrong? What can I check? So essentially, if there is a test that's a lot more stringent, it can be, okay, are you meeting this? Yes, no, then you don't have too many concerns, or yes, you do. Because at the moment, it's quite a balancing exercise of going through that control versus intention, checking what their hours are, checking, do you have this? And there's no definite answer. It's very much, okay, well, it depends how that would be interpreted.
Just wanted to touch on ACT MP Laura Trask's bill. So that's around protecting negotiations for exit discussions. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so that's a very, very recent, bill, and it's essentially drawn from the members' ballot, which is introduced to Parliament. So similar to the high income threshold, the purpose of it is to provide that, parties with the flexibility to negotiate, particularly the termination of employment. So under this bill, employers would be able to make an offer to an employee for the purposes of negotiating the termination of their employment, and the offer sort of as an exit amount wouldn't create grounds for a personal grievance claim. Because at the moment, those kind of conversations could lead to a constructive dismissal or, unjustified dismissal sort of claim. And the bill is sort of very similar to what exists overseas. So it's going to be interesting to see if that gets brought in, whether the same sort of issues, if depending on what they are, come in. But at the moment, yes, it's a members' bill, not a government bill. And whether
so what does that mean? What does that difference mean? I mean, where does it go from here?
It really depends if it's going to progress through the House and if in what form. So essentially, there's a lot more loopholes that need to be kind of jumped through before this even moves further. But in saying that, I think the interesting point is it's quite similar to sort of ACT's and the government's kind of current sort of view is, making things a lot more certain for employers, providing them options. So it might gain some traction and some support from the coalition government. So it'll be something to keep an eye on. Employers, just particularly if this does progress any further, it'll be interesting to see if it does and what that really means.
Holidays Act reform. What's your take on what might come out of that? Because it's kind of she's thrown the previous plan out and starting anew, isn't she?
Yeah, so this has been going on for a very, very long time. So I think in terms of what employers are thinking, it's probably okay. Well, when are we going to get an answer? It's been going on for a very long time. Look, I think in my view, it's very important that we do get it. She does get it right. There's no point spending all of this time, energy, and not reaching a good outcome. So it needs to be something that makes sense for everyone, that hopefully lasts a long time, as opposed to having to review this again in, some years. So I think, seeking feedback, again, the feedback obviously came back that it's not really going to solve the issue. So again, making sure, okay, well, what can we do? What was the feedback? What can make it more clear? And hopefully that leads to some sort of outcome relatively soon that's able to be implemented.
And just finally, Ruby, it has been a big year for employment law in 2024. What do you think's in the one for 2025?
I think it will be sort of, if these changes are implemented, a big shift for employers and employees, more to be aware of. So really important to seek legal advice. We're still seeing sometimes that people aren't aware of changes that happened last year, which just shows the importance of, look, things do change, keep an eye on it, and then just, again, hopefully using these things to employers' benefit. And the same goes for employees. There are benefits in these changes for them too, particularly around certainty, being given opportunities and things like that. So it's keeping an eye on those changes, staying up to date and really seeking advice if you do have questions or you think it may, affect you.
And that wraps up the weekly wrap for this year. We'll be back once again with all the top video stories early in the new year. In the meantime, the team will be working hard throughout the festive season to bring you the latest business news you can use on mbr.co.nz. Merry Christmas and see you next year.